Andre Coleman had 10 minutes left to reach the most important interview of his life when the black SUV ahead of him drifted, snapped sideways, and left the highway. He could have kept driving toward the job that would finally pull his family out of debt. Instead, the black single father braked hard, went down the embankment, and dragged an unconscious woman out of a smoking wreck. He kept her breathing until the ambulance came and watched his last chance leave with it. Hours later, Vivian Sterling, chief executive of Sterling Dynamics, woke holding a rejected applicant file marked with 2 words, "Former SEAL." If you believe quiet courage deserves to be seen, take 1 second to subscribe. And stay for the turn that finally makes powerful people pay. Andre Coleman woke before the sun in a small house at the edge of a town most people only ever drove through. The suit was already laid out on the kitchen table, taken in at the shoulders by his daughter the night before because it had been bought for a younger and heavier man. The position was Director of Crisis Response at Sterling Dynamics, and it was not an ordinary job. He had passed 4 rounds of assessment to become one of 2 finalists, and the salary would have erased his daughter's tuition loan and ended a long chain of temporary contracts. More than the money, it was the first time in years a serious company had looked at what he could do instead of at the gaps in his history. He had prepared quietly and completely, and he had said nothing to Imani about how frightened he was. When she called at 6:00 from her dorm, he told her it was only an interview, and she told him it was only a formality, and neither statement was true. Andre had a habit of shrinking large things to a manageable size before handing them to other people, and it had made him a good leader once and a difficult man to help ever since. He stood in the doorway of an empty house a moment longer than he needed to, thinking about his wife, who had been gone 3 years now, and who would have made a joke about the tie. The drive took him along the coastal expressway, where the morning fog had not yet burned off the guardrails. Andre drove in the right lane, eyes moving in a pattern drilled into him so long ago that it no longer felt like training. That was how he noticed the black SUV 200 FT ahead of him. Its brake lights flared bright and steady, but the vehicle did not slow. And that mismatch between signal and behavior set something cold and familiar loose in his chest. The rear wheels shuddered in a rhythm he had seen twice before, both times in vehicles whose stability systems had stopped talking to their brakes. The SUV crossed 2 lanes in less than 4 seconds. It clipped the median, went light on its suspension, and slid down the far embankment into a stand of scrub pine with a sound like a dropped safe. Andre looked at the clock on his dashboard, and the clock said he had 10 minutes, and the interview was 19 miles ahead of him. 3 cars slowed. None of them stopped. Then Andre saw the hand. It came up against the inside of the driver's window, pale and open, and struck the glass twice with almost no force at all. The way a hand moves when the person attached to it is already losing the argument with their own body. Smoke had begun to lift from the seam of the hood. Andre pulled onto the shoulder and did not look at the clock again. He stripped off his tie and threw it on the seat with his phone and the folder holding every copy of his resume. He took the window punch and the shears from the door pocket because he had carried them in every vehicle he had owned since he was 24 and went down the embankment. Nothing he did in the next 11 minutes looked heroic from the outside. He circled the wreck once before he touched it because the first thing you learn about a crash is that it can still kill you. He noted the faint fuel smell, the thin electrical crackle beneath the dash, and the way the driver's door had folded at the hinge and would not open for anyone without hydraulic tools. He reached through the shattered rear glass, found the emergency cutoff behind the console panel, and killed the electrical system, which bought him whatever margin he was going to get. Then, he punched the window at the lower corner, cleared the glass with his jacket-wrapped forearm, and looked at the woman inside. She was in her late 30s, dark hair matted at the temple, pinned by a locked belt and by a knee wedged under a deformed section of the dash. Her breathing was shallow and getting shallower. Andre talked to her in short, flat sentences because long sentences require a listener and she did not have one to spare. He held her head in line with her spine with one hand and cut the belt with the other, then waited because moving her too fast would have been the thing that hurt her, not the crash. When her leg came free, he brought her out through the window and laid her on his folded jacket in the wet grass clear of the smoke. He kept her talking. He checked her pupils, found the pulse at her throat, when her wrist got hard to read, and tipped her head to keep her airway open when her breathing began to whistle. The ambulance took 19 minutes, which is not a long time unless you are counting them one at a time with your fingers on someone's artery. At some point, her eyes tracked past his face to a laminated visitor pass that had slipped out of the folder, and she saw the name printed on it before her eyes rolled back. When the medics arrived, one of them asked why on earth he was wearing a suit. Andre checked his watch, saw that his interview had begun 22 minutes ago, and said he had somewhere to be. They asked what his training was. He said he knew some first aid. That was the kind of lie that is technically true, and he had been telling it for 8 years. He gave a statement to a trooper, declined to be checked out, and climbed back to his truck with mud to the knee, a torn sleeve, and blood on his cuff that was not his own. Then he drove the 19 miles to Sterling Dynamics anyway, because a stubborn and unfashionable belief still lived in him that if you explain yourself honestly, reasonable people will listen. The lobby of Sterling Dynamics was glass and pale stone and smelled faintly of cut flowers. The woman at the front desk looked at Andre the way you look at weather coming in over a picnic. He gave his name, said he had been in an accident, and asked whether the interview panel might still be available. She made 2 calls with her hand cupped around the receiver. What arrived was not the panel. It was Vanessa Pruitt, chief people officer in a cream jacket with 3 managers behind her, who had clearly been told there was something worth seeing. Vanessa looked at him for a long moment, from the mud on his shoes to the torn shoulder seam, then asked in a voice pitched to carry across the lobby whether he understood what the word punctual meant. Andre did not perform the story. He said there had been a wreck on the expressway, that a woman had been trapped, and that he had stopped because he could not leave her there. He did not say he had cut her free, or carried her, or kept her breathing for 19 minutes. He offered the trooper's name and badge number. Vanessa smiled the way people smile when they have already decided how a thing is going to end. She said the company was hiring a director of crisis response, and that she found it instructive that a candidate for that role could not manage the crisis of his own calendar. One of the managers behind her laughed, then looked at the floor. Vanessa informed him that the position had gone that morning to the other finalist, a young man whose family had known Rosalind Vance for years. Andre asked for 5 minutes. He did not ask twice. Vanessa told him in front of the desk staff and 11 people waiting for elevators that the company needed leadership, not men who showed up late with heroic stories hoping someone would feel sorry for them. Andre stood very still. Later, several people in that lobby would describe the stillness, and none of them could explain why it had made them uncomfortable. He thanked her for her time, which cost him something, then walked out and sat in his truck with his hands on the wheel. It is worth pausing on what actually happened in that lobby, because it was not cruelty so much as procedure. Every person standing there was reading a surface, the mud, the torn seam. The missing appointment and a surface can be read in 4 seconds, while the truth of that morning would have taken 4 minutes and a phone call to a trooper. Institutions almost always choose the reading that is faster, and that requires no one to be wrong. The blood on his cuff was the single most important fact in the room, and it was the only one nobody asked about. He did not call Imani. He drove home, changed, went to the warehouse where he had been picking up night shifts, and asked for a double to cover the wages he had lost. There is something worth carrying out of that morning. The 10 minutes he gave away were the cheapest thing he owned that day, and he did not know it yet. But nobody has ever regretted being the person who pulled over, and almost everyone remembers the day they drove past. 19 miles away, in a private hospital owned by Sterling Dynamics, a medic emptying a folded jacket found a leather folder with a name printed on the applicant tab, Andre Coleman. Vivienne Sterling surfaced a little after 4:00 in the afternoon with a headache like a struck bell and 11 staples in her scalp. Her chief of staff told the story in the flat, careful voice people use around executives who have almost died a loss of vehicle control, a rollover, a fire that never quite started, and a man who had cut her free and carried her clear. She asked who he was, and nobody could tell her much beyond a name and a trooper's report. She asked whether anyone had thanked him, and the silence that followed answered the question more completely than words would have. Then her assistant set the folder on the tray table, and Vivienne recognized the recruiting logo before she recognized anything else because she had approved that logo herself 2 years earlier. It was one of her own company's applicant files. She turned it over with fingers that did not want to cooperate and found the name Andre Coleman and the disposition stamp entered at 11:00 that morning. Withdrawn from consideration unprofessional conduct. She called the people office from the hospital bed and studied the incident summary Vanessa Pruitt had written while Vivian was still unconscious 3 floors below. The summary described a candidate who had arrived nearly an hour late, disheveled, argumentative, demanding accommodation. It used the phrase poor judgment under pressure, which Vivian went over 4 times, sitting in a hospital gown with a line in her arm, having been carried up an embankment by the man the sentence was about. She had built a company on the premise that documents were reliable and people were not. She was beginning to understand that a document is only ever as reliable as whoever holds the pen. She asked for his full application unabridged. The military section was 4 lines long, 12 years of service specialization in personnel recovery reconnaissance and crisis response. A decoration for actions during a rescue operation listed without the citation, honorable discharge. He had been a SEAL, and he had written about it the way another man might list a summer job with no photograph and no reference letter to make the point louder. Vivienne had spent her adult life among people who inflated their credentials into architecture, and here was a man who had folded his into a paragraph and left it in a drawer. What stayed with her was not the record. It was that he had knelt in the mud beside a stranger for 19 minutes and told the medics he knew some first aid. It was that he had walked into her lobby covered in her blood and had not once said the word SEAL. Not when it would have won him the interview. Not when it would have won him an apology. He had let Vanessa Pruitt humiliate him rather than use a medal as a bargaining chip. Vivienne Sterling, who evaluated human beings by school network and title and who was very good at it, understood from a hospital bed that her entire instrument was calibrated wrong. She called Vanessa directly. Vanessa was smooth and immediate. "The man might well have exaggerated," she said, since it was a remarkable coincidence that a candidate for a crisis role should happen upon a crisis involving the chief executive on the morning of his own interview. It was, Vivienne admitted, a remarkable coincidence. She asked for the lobby footage. Vanessa said the system retained recordings for only 72 hours and that she would look into it. And something in the smoothness of that answer stayed lodged in Vivienne like a splinter. Rosalind Vance arrived at 7:00 with white orchids and a face arranged into precisely the correct proportion of concern. She said all the right things, and then around the 9th minute produced a folder of her own, and suggested that given the concussion and the doctor's caution about cognitive load, Vivienne might sign a limited proxy for the board session that week. A formality, she called it. When Vivienne asked about the man who had pulled her out, Rosalind's face changed by perhaps 2%. And she said it was unfortunate how often unemployed veterans found ways to attach themselves to wealthy people. Vivienne did not sign the proxy. After Rosalind left, she asked for 2 things: the telemetry from her vehicle and the security schedule governing her transportation. The telemetry came back with a gap. The event data module, which Sterling Dynamics itself manufactured and which was designed to survive a rollover and a fire, had returned an empty block for the 90 seconds surrounding the crash. And the schedule showed her driver released the previous evening and her route revised at 11:40 at night by someone with administrative authority, which was how a woman who had not driven herself to work in 4 years ended up alone behind the wheel. Vivienne sat with the folder in her lap for a long time. When her chief of staff asked whether she wanted Andre Coleman restored to the candidate list, she said the sentence that changed the direction of everything that followed. "Do not offer that man a job," she said. "First find out who put my vehicle off the road." And when the company's people drove to the address on file the next morning, Andre was not home because he was 6 hours into a 12-hour shift moving pallets in a warehouse 40 minutes. Inland making back the wages he had lost going to an interview he had never been allowed to attend. Vivienne went to the warehouse herself at 9:00 at night against medical advice and against the advice of everyone she employed. She waited by the loading bay with a scarf over her staples, and when Andre came out on his break, he recognized her immediately and said nothing about it. She thanked him. He said she was welcome. Then she offered him a check for an amount that would have cleared Imani's tuition loan twice over, and he did not take it. And the refusal was so mild and so complete that she found herself off balance for the first time in years. He told her he had stopped because stopping was the thing to do, not because it was an invoice. She said she wanted to reopen the interview, and Andre asked the question she would think about for months afterward. Whether she actually believed he was the right person for the role or whether she simply felt indebted. Because those two things looked identical from the outside and only one of them was worth anything. Vivian was used to gratitude arriving on schedule. She heard herself get defensive, heard him decline the bait, and understood in a warehouse parking lot that this man had assessed her more accurately in 11 minutes than most of her board had in 6 years. So instead of answering, she asked what he had seen at the crash. He told her in order without embellishment the brake lights had been illuminated while the vehicle failed to decelerate, which meant the pedal command and the braking system were no longer in agreement. The electronic door releases had locked instead of unlatching after impact, the opposite of the design behavior. The automatic collision notification had never transmitted, though the antenna was intact. And there had been a faint chemical smell near the lower console that he associated with an overheated aftermarket relay. Any one of those, he said, was a bad day. All four at once was a decision. Vivian offered him a 48-hour engagement as an independent advisor, and Andre accepted with 3 conditions which he stated once and did not negotiate. First, that his data access be lawful and documented, because he had no intention of building a case a lawyer could set on fire. Second, that every finding go simultaneously to an outside auditor, so nothing he discovered could live or die inside the company that might be responsible for it. Third, that she never use his service record as marketing. Vivian agreed to all 3 and privately noted that the third had come out fastest. Sterling Dynamics received him the following morning with a visitor badge and an escort. Vanessa Pruitt intercepted him in the corridor and said with a warmth that fooled nobody that he should not confuse a chief executive's gratitude with an assessment of his leadership. Andre said he had never confused the two, and that she should be careful not to confuse a personnel file with a person. Rosalind Vance was friendlier. She found him 3 times that day, always in passing, and each time the conversation curved toward the same place. What had he seen at the scene? Had he touched the console? Had anyone else been down the embankment with him? By the second afternoon, Andre had stopped answering her and started watching her. She never asked how Vivian was. She never asked how he had gotten the door open or whether the fire had been close, which were the 2 questions every other person in the building had asked within 90 seconds of meeting him. She was not interested in the rescue. She was interested in the evidence. And when Andre got into the maintenance telemetry with the vendor's cooperation and a signed access order, he found what she was worried about. A remote service command pushed to the vehicle 17 minutes before the crash, disabling the stability arbitration and the post-impact unlock sequence, authorized through an account on the executive floor. He sat with that in a borrowed conference room, watching the timestamp blink, and understood that everything he thought he was doing had changed shape. He had believed he was helping a company find an outside attacker. He was standing inside a building with the person who had done it. Whoever sent that instruction knew the vehicle architecture, intimately held administrative privilege, and had 17 minutes of foresight. That narrowed the field to fewer than 9 people. And of those 9, only one spent 2 days asking a stranger what he had seen. Rosalind Vance did not panic because Rosalind Vance had never panicked in her life. She was 47, 3rd generation of a family that had made its money in private capital, and she had learned before she was 20 that you do not fight an opponent, you rearrange the ground beneath him. 2 days later, an anonymous message appeared on the company's internal network, addressed to all staff expressing concern about the outside advisor walking the executive floor. It noted that he had departed a military assignment following a conflict with a senior officer. It used the words unstable, difficult to control, and refused a lawful instruction. It alleged nothing specific and was in the way of such things entirely unanswerable. Vanessa Pruitt summoned him that same morning with a note-taker present and asked whether he had any psychological conditions that might render his conduct unpredictable in a corporate environment. She asked it gently, which made it worse. Andre sat with his hands flat on the table and recognized the machinery for what it was because he had watched it operate on other men. You do not have to prove a veteran is dangerous. You only have to raise the possibility and let everyone finish the sentence privately. 12 years of service reduced to a rumor about a temper. He answered every question briefly and truthfully, then asked for a copy of the record which he was told he would receive and never did. The truth about his last deployment was smaller and less dramatic than the message implied, which is generally the case. A defense contractor had supplied tactical communication units with a firmware defect that caused them to drop encryption under thermal load. Andre had documented it, reported it, and been told to keep using them. During an extraction, 3 units failed within 4 minutes of one another, and 2 men were badly hurt in the confusion that followed. Afterward, a senior officer with a career to protect asked him to sign a report attributing the failure to operator error by the team on the ground. He had raised his voice exactly once in 12 years, and that had been the occasion. He refused to sign. He submitted his own report instead with the firmware logs attached, and protected 4 subordinates who would otherwise have carried the blame for a defect that had been known and ignored. There was no disciplinary action because there was nothing to discipline. There was simply from that week forward a permanent absence of opportunity, and eventually an honorable discharge into a civilian market where the same contractor sat on the boards of 6 companies that never quite had a role for him. He had never made any of it public because half the file involved other men's names and their careers were not his to spend. Rosalind moved before he could finish. She convened the executive committee and, with a great show of reluctance, raised her concern that a chief executive who hands an internal security investigation to the man who rescued her is not an executive making a decision, she is a patient making an attachment. Everett Lockhart, 63 years old and chairman since before half the room had graduated, asked one question, which was whether any of this could reach the press. Told that it could, he directed that the advisory engagement be terminated immediately. Vivian objected. She was steady for 4 minutes. Then Rosalind produced a document, a summary of a formal complaint from a naval officer describing a subordinate who had shouted at him during a review of an operational incident. It was real. It was also 9 years old, 4 paragraphs long, and stripped of every piece of context that made it comprehensible. And in the silence that followed, Andre heard something enter Vivian Sterling's voice that he had heard in other rooms from other people about to do the convenient thing. A small hesitation, a half-second of recalculation, the sound of someone deciding to ask him to explain himself. He did not let her finish the question. He took the visitor badge off his lanyard, and set it on the table in front of her. He said evenly that she could not ask a man to find the truth and treat him as the suspect every time the truth became inconvenient, and that she should decide which of those 2 things she actually wanted, because he had spent 8 years being useful to institutions that wanted both. He thanked the committee for its time. He walked out through a room of people who did not look up. But before he left the building, from a chair in the lobby, Andre sent Vivian Sterling a single encrypted file. It contained the maintenance chain of custody he had assembled over 4 days. The servicing of her vehicle had been subcontracted through 2 intermediaries to a firm incorporated 14 months earlier, whose sole funding came from a holding company sharing a registered agent with Iron Veil Capital. Iron Veil had spent 9 months trying to acquire Sterling's emergency response division at a valuation the market considered indecent, and Vivian was the vote standing in the way. That night, at 11 minutes past 2:00 in the morning, an alert reached her phone. The original telemetry archive was being purged, and the request had originated inside Sterling Dynamics. She got out of bed and worked until dawn alone, with his file open on one screen and the audit trail on the other. Somewhere around 4:00 in the morning, she found the thing that reframed the entire week. Andre had on his second day generated 3 versions of his preliminary findings, each naming a slightly different physical location for the vehicle's backup data module, and routed one to the security group, one to legal, and one to the chief operating officer's office. The deletion sweep that ran that night had targeted precisely and only the location named in the version that had gone to Rosalind Vance. It was not proof, and Andre had written exactly that at the bottom of the file in the plain style he used for everything. This is a directional indicator, not a conclusion, and it must be validated by an independent party. But it meant the leak had a single address, and it meant that the man they had thrown out of the building had anticipated being thrown out, had built a test that would keep working after he was gone. and had preserved every bite of it beyond the company's reach so that she could continue without him. He had not left her a weapon. He had left her a map and no bill, and this is the part I keep turning over. A man who had just been humiliated twice by the same company spent his last hours inside it, protecting the people who would still be there after he was gone. Most of us in that chair would have taken the file home and let the building learn its lesson the hard way. He did not. And I think that is the real difference between being strong and being good. One of them is available to anyone who is angry enough, and the other only shows up when nobody is watching and nothing is owed. She found him the next evening at his house, which was small and clean, and had a photograph of a woman in a hospital scarf on the hallway wall. She apologized not with a settlement, but with the sentence she owed him that she had let a room full of powerful people turn 12 years of his service into a reason to doubt his character, and that she had hesitated when she should not have. Andre did not accept it easily, which she respected more than she expected to. He said it was not the first time he had watched people praise a veteran's service at a podium in the morning and use it against him in a conference room by the afternoon. Then Imani called, and Andre took it in the kitchen. She was 19, studying biomedical engineering 4 hours north, and someone in her cohort had found the anonymous message and passed it around. She was not upset for herself. She was upset that her father's name was being handled by people who had never met him. And Andre told her with his back to the doorway, where Vivian could hear him, that he was going to step away from the whole thing because a job was a job and she was his daughter, and the arithmetic was not difficult. Imani said no. She reminded him in the direct way she had inherited from her mother that he had raised her on one rule above all others, which was that you do not stay quiet when you know somebody is in danger, and that she was not going to be the reason he broke it. She said she could survive some talk and asked whether the woman in that vehicle could survive the next attempt. Andre stood in his own kitchen with no answer, and his 19-year-old daughter hung up on him gently the way she did when she knew she had won. Vivienne offered immediately to have Imani's personal information protected and every reference to her removed from company systems. Andre said that was not enough. And this was the moment Vivian understood what kind of man had been in front of her all along. He did not want a shield for his own family. He wanted a policy, written protection for every employee at Sterling Dynamics who reported wrongdoing and was punished for it, enforced by a body that did not report to the chief operating officer. If she wanted him back, it would not be as a favor between two people. It would be with the structure changed underneath him. Vivienne signed the charter for an independent audit group at 7 Karlsruhe the following morning with outside counsel as its chair, and a direct line to the ethics committee of the board. Andre returned, and he returned differently. No visitor badge, no informal arrangement, no gratitude economy. He had a written mandate, a defined scope, and an obligation to report findings whether or not the chief executive liked them. Within 3 days, working alongside 2 forensic accountants and a vehicle systems engineer, the group established the sequence. Rosalind Vance's credentials had revised Vivian's route and released her security driver at 11:40 the night before the crash, 16 minutes after her badge last opened her own office door. The intent was never necessarily to kill her, which was in some ways the coldest part of it. A dead chief executive triggers investigations, insurance, forensics, and federal interest. An injured one triggers a medical leave. Rosalind had needed Vivian absent or discredited for roughly 3 weeks. The window required for the board to approve the Iron Veil transaction and for a personal position held through a family vehicle to convert into something in the range of $90 million. She had not gambled with Vivian's life so much as budgeted for it. And that Thursday notice went out that the board session had been advanced to 9:00 the next morning with the acquisition vote as the second item. The session was held in the main atrium rather than the boardroom, which told Andre everything about how it was meant to go. Rosalind had invited major shareholders, outside counsel, 2 members of the Iron Veil Partnership, and enough staff to fill the gallery. She opened not with the transaction, but with concern, which was always her opening. She spoke for 6 minutes about her admiration for Vivian, about the difficulty of recovery from head trauma, and about her duty to raise the question of whether a chief executive who had handed an internal investigation to the man who rescued her was exercising sound judgment or something more human and less appropriate. Andre had been summoned as a witness. He understood within 90 seconds that he had been summoned as an exhibit. Vanessa Pruitt took the floor and put an image on the atrium screens. Security footage of a man in a ruined suit standing in the lobby, mud to the knee sleeve, torn a dark stain on his cuff, arguing with the head of the people function. She read her amended incident summary aloud, describing a candidate who had arrived an hour late, behaved aggressively, and demanded preferential treatment. Somebody in the gallery laughed at the image. Andre looked at the blood on his own cuff and thought about how few people in that room knew whose it was. Then Rosalind turned to him with an expression of gentle curiosity and asked the question she had been saving for 11 days. "You were a SEAL," she said, 12 years. "A decoration, a specialty in rescue. So, explain to this room why a man with that record is currently working night shifts moving boxes in a warehouse." It required no accusation. It simply invited 200 people to complete a syllogism whose conclusion was that excellent men do not end up in warehouses, and therefore nothing he had found was worth opening. Andre stood up. He said that after his discharge, his wife had been diagnosed with an illness that took 4 years to kill her, and that during those 4 years, he had turned down every position requiring travel because there had been a girl who needed one parent in the house at night. He said he had taken contract work because contract work let him be at the hospital on Tuesdays. He said he did not consider any of that a failure, and that anyone who believed a man's worth could be measured by the ceiling of his last job title had never needed somebody to stop for them on the side of a road. The atrium was very quiet. Rosalind pivoted without a flicker. She suggested the entire rescue was more convenient than credible. That a man who had failed to secure the role had encountered the chief executive in extremis on the very morning of his own interview, and that the coincidence had been engineered rather than endured. Everett Lockhart, who wanted only for this to stop existing before the markets opened, asked security to escort the advisor out. 2 officers moved along the gallery wall. Andre did not resist, because resisting was what they wanted on camera, and because he had understood for 3 days exactly how this room was going to behave. He walked to the long table and set down a small memory card in a sealed evidence sleeve, signed and countersigned by the vehicle systems vendor and a partner from the outside audit firm. He said, loud enough for the gallery that they could remove him from the building, but they could not remove a timestamp. Rosalind said the card represented an unverified security risk and directed that it not be opened. And it was into that sentence, into the exact silence after it, that the atrium doors opened, and Vivian Sterling walked in. 11 staples in her scalp discharged against medical advice 90 minutes earlier, with outside counsel on one side of her and the chair of the audit group on the other. She did not raise her voice. She said the man standing by the door was not the subject of any investigation at Sterling Dynamics. She said the subject of the investigation was the chief operating officer, that the scope had been authorized in writing on Monday, and that the findings were now before the board. Rosalind Vance absorbed this without a single change of expression, and then she smiled and said she appreciated Vivian's theatrics, but that she had spent the last 4 days securing commitments and now held enough votes to remove her from the chief executive's chair before lunch. Rosalind laid her proxies on the table like a winning hand, and for perhaps 90 seconds the room belonged to her. Vivian did not argue with any of it. She simply asked that the sealed card be opened in front of outside counsel, the audit chair, and the partner who had signed the chain of custody. And Everett Lockhart, who was many things but not stupid, realized that refusing that request in front of 200 witnesses would end his own career instead of somebody else's. The card went into a laptop that had never been on the company network. The atrium screens changed, and the room began very slowly to turn. The remote service instruction that had disabled the stability arbitration and the post-impact door release had been authorized at 8:19 that morning from a terminal registered to the office of the chief operating officer. Vivian's route revision and the release of her security driver had been executed the previous night under Rosalind Vance's own credentials. The automatic collision notification had been suppressed by a configuration change bundled into the same package. The firm that serviced the vehicle had received 4 payments totaling $640,000 from a company sharing a registered agent with an Iron Vale holding entity. And the last item on the screen was a revision history showing that Vanessa Pruitt had edited Andre Coleman's interview record at 4:11 in the afternoon, 40 minutes after learning who the woman on the embankment had been. Rosalind said calmly that her credentials had evidently been compromised and that the timing suggested a deliberate frame. It was a good answer. It was very nearly good enough. And that was when Andre, still standing near the doors between two security officers, asked whether the board would like to test it. He explained the 3 versions, 3 preliminary summaries, 3 offices each naming a different physical location for the backup module, only one of them fictional. That fictional address had gone to the office of the chief operating officer and nowhere else. 2 employees of an Iron Vale affiliate had been recorded by a municipal traffic camera at that address the next morning, trying to open a storage unit that contained nothing at all. It was not a stolen credential. A stolen credential does not send men to an address that exists only inside one specific version of one specific document. Vanessa Pruitt stood up too quickly and began explaining that she had edited the interview record at Rosalind's instruction, that she had been told the candidate was a liability, that she had known nothing about a vehicle. The revision log still on the screens behind her showed her account making the changes and her account alone. 2 board members who had signed Rosalind's proxies that morning quietly asked for them to be withdrawn from the record. Vivian spoke once more and only to close the exit. Certified copies of the complete evidence file, she said, had been delivered to the outside auditor to the company's Securities Council and to the appropriate authorities at 6:00 that morning, 3 hours before this session opened. Nothing on the screens existed solely within Sterling Dynamics. No administrative privilege inside the building could reach it. Everett Lockhart, who had spent 30 years choosing stability over conscience and had just watched that trade fail, publicly suspended, the chief operating officer voided the acquisition vote and referred the matter to a special committee. In that order, in under 2 minutes. There was no violence, and nobody was dragged out. Rosalind Vance's access was revoked from a terminal at the front desk while she was still walking toward it, and she was escorted from the atrium through a corridor lined with people who had been on her side an hour earlier and who now found other places to look. At the door, she stopped in front of Andre and for the first time in 11 days showed a hairline crack. He had only won, she said, because he had happened to be in the right place at the right time. Andre looked at her for a moment. "I was in the right place," he said, "because you built your entire plan on the belief that nobody would stop." And the room understood all at once what her actual mistake had been. She had chosen that stretch of expressway, that hour, that vehicle, on the assumption that everyone is selfish, that a man 10 minutes from the interview of his life would keep driving, and that a woman trapped behind a locked door would be found by paramedics rather than by a stranger with a window punch. Her plan had been sound, and it failed on one unmodeled variable. There is something quiet to take from all of that. A reputation can be damaged by anyone in an afternoon, but it can only be built by the way a person behaves on ordinary days. So when someone hands you a story about a person you have never met, the kindest and the smartest thing are the same thing, which is to go and find out for yourself. Afterward, in a smaller room, Vivian offered Andre the position of Director of Crisis Response on the spot at the compensation originally posted. He did not take it. She had expected almost any response except that one. He said the search had been corrupted before he ever walked into the building, and that if she simply handed him the job now, every person at Sterling Dynamics would be entitled to believe he had been paid for a rescue, and they would be right. And he would spend 5 years managing that suspicion instead of managing emergencies. He had watched what a rumor could do to a man's work. He was not going to build a department on one. What he asked for instead was that the search be run again properly, with an independent selection panel, external assessors, and no involvement whatsoever from anyone who had touched the first process. He would apply like anybody else. Vivian agreed. Vanessa Pruitt was suspended pending the falsification review, and the company issued a correction to every employee stating plainly that Andre Coleman had not behaved unprofessionally, that he had arrived late because he had freed the chief executive from a wrecked vehicle and kept her alive until paramedics arrived, and that it regretted what had been said to him in its lobby. The second interview lasted 3 hours. Andre spoke about his service record for perhaps 4 minutes of it because the record was context and not an argument. The rest was a plan. separate the security and emergency functions from the operating officer's reporting line entirely so that no single executive could ever again both create an incident and control its investigation. Mirror all critical telemetry to an external escrow. Codify protection for employees who report wrongdoing with an appeals path outside the people function. And build every emergency procedure so that it still works when the executive floor is unreachable, unavailable, or compromised because in his experience the executive floor was frequently all three. The panel understood by the end that they were not choosing him because he had been a SEAL. They were choosing him because he was the only candidate in the room who had thought seriously about what happens to an organization when its most powerful person is the problem, and who had designed a system that did not depend on any individual being trustworthy. The vote was recorded, published internally, and unanimous. On a Thursday morning in the company auditorium, Vivian Sterling handed Andre Coleman a permanent badge. And the man who had been told he could not manage his own schedule took authority over every emergency operation the corporation ran on 3 continents. He did not use it to settle anything. 2 of the managers who had laughed in the lobby that morning still worked in his reporting line, and he never mentioned it. And one of them eventually apologized in a hallway, and Andre told him it was fine and meant it. What he did instead was insist that the standards applied to everyone, including the chief executive who discovered in her 2nd month that she was expected to complete the same emergency certification as a warehouse supervisor, and who complained about it and who completed it. That was the shape of his victory, and it was why it mattered. He had walked into a world of powerful people without becoming another version of them. 6 months later, the special committee published its findings. Rosalind Vance had manipulated vehicle service systems, altered executive movement schedules, and coordinated with Iron Veil Capital to depress the valuation of a division she stood to profit from personally. The legal process moved forward the way such processes do, slowly and in paperwork. Vanessa Pruitt was terminated for cause over the falsified records. The Iron Veil transaction was abandoned. 4 board members did not stand for re-election, and Everett Lockhart retired in the spring with a statement about changing times that fooled nobody and offended no one. Sterling Dynamics adopted every one of Andre's proposals, including the ones that made its executives uncomfortable, which were the ones that mattered. Imani came down for the first full-scale emergency exercise her father directed and stood at the back of a control room watching. 140 people move on his instructions with the same unhurried voice he had used to talk her through a broken arm when she was 8. It was long enough to see her father finally recognized without having traded away a single thing to get there. On the drive back to the train, she told him she was proud of him, and he changed the subject and she let him. He kept the truck. He kept the house. The new title did not put distance between him and his daughter, and it did not turn him into a man who mentioned his service record at parties because he had never been that man, and a promotion is not a personality. Vivian changed too, more slowly and more visibly. She stopped treating authority as evidence that she was correct. She started asking the second question instead of accepting the first answer, and she developed a habit alarming to her staff of walking down to the loading dock and talking to people whose names had never appeared in any file she had ever opened. What grew between them was not gratitude, which is a debt, and not romance, which would have been cheap. It was respect, which takes longer and holds better. They disagreed constantly and professionally about budgets and staffing and how much risk a company may accept on behalf of people who never voted for it. The difference was that Vivienne no longer used her position to end a disagreement, and Andre no longer assumed that a person with power was necessarily performing. One evening in October, after a night exercise ran long and the control room emptied out, she asked the question she had been carrying since the warehouse parking lot, why he had not simply kept driving that morning. He thought about it a while before answering, which was one of the things she had come to like about him. He said he had spent 12 years in places where people died in the 4 minutes between somebody noticing a problem and somebody deciding it was theirs. He said the most dangerous assumption in the world is that another person will stop. Vivian said quietly that he had lost a job that day because of her. And Andre shook his head and told her no. He had lost an interview, not a job, and that any job worth having had to belong to the man he actually was not, to the man he would have had to become to arrive on time. She asked him to get a cup of coffee. She said, with unusual care, that it was not a meeting, that it was not an offer from a chief executive, and that he was welcome to say no without anything at all happening to his position. Andre smiled, which he did not do often, and said yes. That was as far as it went that autumn, and neither of them was in any hurry, and that was rather the point. The last thing to say is about a stretch of coastal expressway 19 miles from the Sterling Dynamics campus, where a black SUV once left the road on a foggy morning and 3 cars slowed and none of them stopped. There is a rapid response beacon system on that curve now, funded by the company and designed by the department Andre runs, and it has been activated 11 times in its first year. And in the training center, where every new employee begins above the console at the front of the room, there is a single sentence the first principal, Andre Coleman, wrote into the curriculum. In a crisis, it says, "A title has never saved anyone. Only a choice can do that." And if the story leaves one thing behind, let it be the smallest part of it. He asked for the search to be run again instead of taking the chair he had earned. And he still parked the same truck outside the same house. Whatever you end up holding one day, hold it the way he did. Apply the rule to yourself first. And let the people who once laughed keep their jobs and their dignity, because the win you never have to defend is the only kind that lasts.